Imagine you are standing in a forest. Not your normal pine or oak forest, but a dense, humid, deeply unsettling swamp. The air is thick, almost soupy, and carries the scent of decaying spores and hot mud. The trees here don't have bark. They have scales, like giant fossilized snakes reaching 100 feet into the muggy sky. We're talking about lycopsid trees, lepidodendron and sigillaria, looking like colossal asparagus stalks wearing chainmail. This is the Carboniferous period, roughly 320 million years ago. Now listen closely. You hear a sound, not a roar, but a rhythmic scraping, a heavy shushing noise like sandpaper dragging across damp concrete. It's moving fast. You look down, and your brain immediately tries to file what you see into the category of small, scary thing, but fails spectacularly. Moving through the primordial muck, spanning the width of a smart car and possessing enough segmented armor to rival a tank, is the undisputed heavyweight champion of Carboniferous creepiness, Arthropleura. If you're a dino normie, you think T-Rex is the pinnacle of historical horror. Cute. The real nightmare fuel of deep history belongs to the invertebrates, and this absolute unit of a millipede was the scariest critter walking the planet before specialized dinosaurs were even a twinkle in evolution's eye. This beast wasn't just big. It defied every expectation of biological physics we hold today. Today, we are diving deep into the reign of Arthropleura, a creature so bizarre and gigantic that it requires us to completely rethink the constraints nature places on life. We're going to figure out how high oxygen levels led to 6-foot-long bugs, what exactly they ate, and why, thankfully, they are nothing more than roadkill in the geological record. The reason Arthropleura existed is tied directly to the atmosphere of its era. If you asked any biologist why insects are small today, the answer almost always comes back to the respiratory system. It's a constraint, a hard limit set by physics and chemistry. The Carboniferous period, which ran from about 359 to 299 million years ago, was a truly wild time. Globally, it was hot, wet, and remarkably stable, allowing massive, dense forests to explode across the continental landmasses, trapping colossal amounts of carbon. This is, incidentally, why we call it the Carboniferous. It's the era that created almost all the coal deposits the world uses today. But the real game changer was the oxygen. Due to the massive runaway growth of these scaled trees and ferns, the largest plants the Earth had seen yet, photosynthesis went into overdrive. The CO2 levels plummeted, and the oxygen concentration in the atmosphere soared. Today, we breathe air that is about 21% oxygen. During the peak of the Carboniferous, the oxygen concentration likely hit a staggering 30% to 35%. That is the biological equivalent of pouring rocket fuel into the evolutionary engine. This high oxygen level is crucial for understanding the sheer scale of Arthropleura. Modern arthropods, like insects and myriapods, don't have lungs or complex circulating blood systems for delivering oxygen. Instead, they use a passive system called tracheal respiration. Think of tracheae as a system of tiny rigid tubes that permeate the body, opening to the outside via little holes called spiracles. Oxygen diffuses directly from the air into the tissues. The problem? Diffusion is slow and only effective over short distances. This passive system sets a hard physical limit on how large an insect can grow. If you're too thick, the oxygen simply won't reach your innermost tissues, and you'll suffocate, no matter how hungry you are. But crank the ambient oxygen up to 35%, that density dramatically increases the pressure gradient, forcing oxygen deeper into the tracheal system. Suddenly, the respiratory constraint that keeps today's spiders and centipedes reasonably small is temporarily lifted. This is the biological loophole that allowed Arthropleura to become an absolute unit. Researchers from institutions like the University of Cambridge have spent decades modeling the diffusion rates, and the consensus is clear. Without the Carboniferous oxygen spike, this monster simply could not have powered its colossal body. The colossal fossil record, 6 feet of nightmare. Let's talk scale. When most people hear millipede, they picture a little brown guy curled up under a rock, maybe a few inches long. Arthropleura was the size of a modern 2-seater sofa, or a very large refrigerator laid on its side. The largest confirmed fossil specimen, discovered in 2018 at a beach in Northumberland, England, blew previous estimates out of the swampy water. It was initially uncovered when a large sandstone block fell onto the beach. This fossilized segment, part of a shed exoskeleton or a complete molted skin, indicated an animal that was conservatively estimated to be 2.7 meters long. That's roughly 8.9 feet, and weighing over 110 pounds. A creature capable of reaching the hood height of a Honda Civic. Imagine that weight, that sheer mass, wrapped in a segmented exoskeleton that looks less like a bug shell and more like overlapping tank armor. The genus Arthropleura encompasses several species, primarily known from two major fossil finds in North America, Ohio, Illinois, and Scotland or northern England, covering a time span from the late Vician to the early Permian. Finding a complete Arthropleura fossil is like winning the paleontological lottery, largely because these animals, like modern arthropods, grew by shedding their armor, a process called ecdysis. When they molted, the massive exoskeleton was often broken down by scavengers or simply disintegrated into the humid swamp floor, leaving behind only scattered fragments. That Northumberland find was particularly remarkable. It was a single articulated segment, preserved perfectly in a river delta deposit. Analyzing the width of that segment, paleontologists from the British Geological Survey revised the top-end estimates upward. They realized previous size projections based on older fragmented fossils had been too modest. When you consider the sheer number of segments, potentially 30 pairs or more, the length quickly balloons. Beyond the body fossils, somatic fossils, we also rely heavily on trace fossils, which are the preserved tracks and trails left by the animal. The tracks attributed to Arthropleura are known as diplycnites and diplopodicnus. These trails are often incredibly wide, sometimes over half a meter across, showing clear evidence of the complex rhythmic gait. Early interpretations of these tracks were baffling. How could such a segmented animal move so quickly and efficiently? Modern millipedes move using waves of legs in a relatively slow creeping motion. Arthropleura's tracks suggest something else entirely. They point to a complex, coordinated tripod gait, where 3 legs on one side are in the air while 3 on the other side are on the ground, maintaining incredible stability and speed. This absolute unit wasn't just a sluggish tanker. It was likely capable of moving at speeds that would make a startled human sweat nervously. If you encountered this thing, you weren't outrunning it unless you had a bicycle. The dinner plate. Dilemma: predator or vegan? This brings us to the question that always defines a paleontological star. What did this horror eat? For decades, the standard interpretation of Arthropleura was pure, unadulterated nightmare fuel. Look at its size. Look at its armor. It had to be the apex predator of its swampy domain, tearing apart early amphibians and smaller invertebrates with massive, terrifying mandibles. This theory was compelling primarily because of its scale. When you are 6 to 9 feet long and weigh 100 pounds, nothing else in your immediate ecosystem is going to mess with you. The terrestrial vertebrates of the time, the early tetrapods like Ichthyostega or Hylonomus, one of the first true reptiles, a tiny short king at the time, were generally small, sluggish, and amphibian-like. They would have been easily overwhelmed. However, modern research, utilizing advanced computed tomography, CT scanning, and closer examination of the mouth parts, tells a different, perhaps even weirder story. The critical piece of evidence is the anatomy of the mouth parts, which are derived from modified legs. If Arthropleura were a hypercarnivore, we would expect to see massive, crushing, piercing mandibles designed to grab and hold slippery, armored prey. Instead, what researchers found suggested something much softer. Mouth parts designed for grinding, scraping, and filtering. The real smoking gun came from the occasional fossilized gut contents and coprolites, fossilized poop, associated with Arthropleura tracks. When examined, these samples showed high concentrations of lycopsid spores, fern fragments, and pulverized, decayed wood. The overwhelming conclusion is that Arthropleura was likely a giant, mobile detritivore and herbivore. It was the Earth's first massive armored compost recycler. Think about the environment. An endless, nutrient-rich swamp floor covered in decaying organic matter and a constant rain of spores and fallen lycopsid bark. Arthropleura's role was to be a gigantic, segmented lawnmower, constantly sifting through the detritus, using its powerful grinding mouth parts to process the tough, fibrous material that most other small creatures couldn't handle. This doesn't make it any less terrifying, however. Imagine encountering an 8-foot vegan who needs to eat constantly to maintain its huge body mass. While it might not be actively hunting you, accidentally tripping over this behemoth would result in instant roadkill. And let's be real, even a vegetarian millipede the size of a bed is going to be the absolute definition of nightmare fuel. This realization also changes our understanding of the carboniferous food web. Arthropleura dominated not by being a killer, but by sheer mass and volume, acting as the primary consumer of the colossal vegetative output, turning plant waste into pure biomass. This ecological niche was only possible because of the density and stability of the rainforests. Mid-roll transition. Speaking of things that need the right fuel to keep going, even the most dedicated paleo nerd needs to stay energized when they are knee-deep in carboniferous swamp history. Diving into the bizarre world of giant bugs and atmospheric anomalies takes serious focus. That's why I rely on Kronos Coffee. Kronos Coffee is not just about a morning buzz. It's about deep focus. Their signature blend, the Permian Decaf, for when you absolutely need to sleep after studying giant arthropods, uses slow-roasted beans designed to give you clarity without the jitters. Because let's face it, when you're trying to visualize a 6-foot millipede crossing a primordial plain, you need your brain running at 100%. Don't let low energy put a stop to your scientific deep dive. Head over to kronoscoffee.com and use the code LOSTWORLD10 for 10% off your first bag. Stop drinking weak coffee and start drinking like a paleontologist. Now back to why all the giant bugs died. The competition, short kings and early reptiles. While Arthropleura was dominating the swamp floor, what else was sharing this high oxygen, high humidity party? The ecosystem of the late Carboniferous was surprisingly sparse in large vertebrate life, which is a major factor in Arthropleura's success. While the seas were full of sharks and large fish, terrestrial life was just beginning its explosive diversification. The dominant predators were not yet the dinosaurs, but rather massive crocodile-like amphibians, creatures like Ariops and Prionosuchus. However, these were often tied to the water, relying on buoyancy to support their mass, and needing to keep their skin moist. They were powerful but often clumsy on land, especially when compared to the efficient multi-legged locomotion of Arthropleura. The first true reptiles were also emerging, tiny, lizard-like animals such as Hylonomus. These were the short kings of the ecosystem, rarely more than a foot long. They had developed amniotic eggs, freeing them from the constant aquatic ties of the amphibians, a major evolutionary leap. But in the face of an 8-foot millipede, they were absolutely insignificant. Easy targets if Arthropleura had bothered to hunt them, or simply fast enough to get out of the way of the giant vegan tank. The real competition for Arthropleura came from other giant arthropods. The Carboniferous was the golden age of bugs. We had massive dragonflies, Meganeura, with wingspans of over 2 feet, flying around like terrifying biological drones. We had giant scorpions, and yes, we had massive nope ropes in the form of early giant snakes, though the true nope ropes really hit their stride later in the Cretaceous. This meant that even though Arthropleura was the terrestrial mass champion, it had to share its high oxygen world with aerial terrors that were equally bizarre and oversized. The high oxygen environment favored gigantism across all arthropod lines, creating an intensely competitive world ruled by size and armor, where only the absolute units survived. The Great Decline. Why the bugs shrank. If the Carboniferous was the high point for giant arthropods, the Permian period, which immediately followed, was the beginning of the end. The party was officially over. The downfall of Arthropleura and the vast majority of giant insects is directly linked to 2 massive global shifts: climate change and the subsequent drop in atmospheric oxygen. Around 300 million years ago, the supercontinent Pangaea began to fully assemble. This massive convergence of land masses triggered significant changes in global weather patterns. The tropical humid swamp forests that Arthropleura relied on began to dry out. The immense coal swamps started giving way to vast, arid inland deserts. The giant lycopsid trees, which required constant water to grow and whose explosive photosynthetic rates had caused the oxygen spike, began to decline dramatically. They were replaced by tougher, more water-efficient plants like conifers and early seed plants, gymnosperms. As the giant coal swamps died off, the global carbon sequestration process slowed, and the oxygen levels in the atmosphere began a steady, irreversible decline, sinking back towards modern levels, around 21–25%. This drop was fatal for the giant bugs. Remember that passive tracheal respiratory system? It works only if the oxygen concentration is high enough to diffuse deep into the tissue mass. As the oxygen levels dropped, the vast internal bodies of Arthropleura could no longer be effectively supplied with oxygen. Essentially, they started suffocating from the inside out. They became too metabolically expensive to maintain. A 2012 study published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences detailed this correlation meticulously, showing a perfect match between the decline in atmospheric oxygen and the maximum size achieved by arthropods across geological time. The bigger the bug, the harder it fell. The smaller arthropods, those we see today, had shorter diffusion distances and could survive this environmental pinch. But for the behemoths like Arthropleura, the evolutionary pressure was insurmountable. They couldn't shrink fast enough, and their habitat was literally drying up beneath their 30-odd pairs of feet. The last known fossils of Arthropleura vanish from the geological record near the beginning of the Permian, roughly 299 million years ago. RIP to the absolute unit. Their extinction paved the way for the ultimate diversification of reptiles and, eventually, mammals. Once the terrestrial environment dried out and the respiratory constraints were reimposed, vertebrates, with their active centralized lung systems, gained the definitive biological advantage. They didn't rely on atmospheric density to breathe. They actively pumped air into dedicated organs, making the 6-foot insect a relic of a strange, high-oxygen past. The legacy of the bizarre behemoth, Arthropleura, remains one of the most bizarre and compelling creatures in the history of life. It's a perfect illustration of how contingent and specific evolution can be. It wasn't a failure of design. It was a perfect adaptation to an extremely unique planet, a planet with a thick, oxygen-rich atmosphere, where the short kings, early reptiles, hadn't yet learned how to hunt efficiently, and the plants were busy pumping out enough organic matter to feed a segmented army. It challenges our modern sensibilities. We are evolutionarily trained to fear sharks, lions, and spiders. But imagine the primal fear of seeing a 6-foot-long, armored, multi-legged organism scraping through the undergrowth. This wasn't just a bug. It was the ultimate invertebrate predator. Even if it was a vegan predator, maintaining that size requires some aggressive defense. The story of Arthropleura is a reminder that the rules of nature are not set in stone. They are mutable boundaries defined by the chemistry of the air and the physics of the environment. Under the right conditions, the simplest life forms can explode in scale, achieving sizes that would otherwise require completely different biological machinery, like lungs and endoskeletons. The fact that we no longer live in a world where a creature the size of a picnic table requires 30 pairs of hiking boots to get around is perhaps the single greatest gift the Permian climate shift ever gave to humanity. We can be grateful that today's terrifying centipedes and millipedes are merely unsettling, not vehicles of mass destruction. Thanks for watching, and until next time on The Lost World.